There are some pretty substantial weak points in the front suspension of 4Runners, FJ Cruisers, and Tacomas.
We're going to be showing you what they are and how we're going to fix those problems on our 4Runner.
If you wheel your rig hard, odds are eventually you're going to either bend or break these two parts. The spindle and the cam tabs. We've bent both. We bent our passenger side spindle years ago on a trail in Moab. The steering arm actually bent in. Now it could have been much worse. In fact, we've been driving on it for the last 4 years. It's been driving just fine, but it's not allowing us to get a perfect toe adjustment. For replacement spindles, there's not a lot of options out there. There's either the original Toyota part or cheaper aftermarket replacements. We're going with original Toyota parts because of all the intricate machining on these. We don't want to take any chances with that.
To greatly reduce the odds of bending another, we're adding gussets.
These are from Total Chaos, and they're going to allow us to retain our sway bar. Once they're welded on, this is going to greatly increase the strength of our spindles. I know a lot of you out there are saying right now, just take off the sway bars. I've had them on for years. Now we've run our FJ Cruiser without sway bars, and off-roading, it's phenomenal. It's a huge difference without them on there. But on the highway going 80 miles an hour, it's pretty sketchy.
The 4Runner is my daily driver. It often sees long days of driving 80 miles an hour on interstate highways. For us, going without a sway bar isn't an option.
You can see here where a few of our cam tabs have been bent. I don't know how or where it happened. I was just under there one day and noticed them. So we got all new cam tabs, again, from Total Chaos. These beefy pieces will totally replace our flimsy stock ones. I'll have to cut and grind the old ones off, and then our buddy Lars at Axle Fab will weld these in their place.
To go with our new cam tabs, we got new lower arm bolts and alignment washers. These and the Total Chaos parts we bought from our friends at Toy Tech Lifts. We'll put a link to them down below.
Now, as long as we have everything torn apart, we're going to put on aftermarket lower control arms too. We went with these from Dirt King, mostly because of their OEM style lower ball joint. We didn't want open joints like uniballs. These are very low maintenance. Just shoot some grease into them at every oil change and they'll last a good long time. And they won't squeak. And when they eventually do wear out, they're very easy to replace and they're an over-the-counter part. And the arms have greasable bushings, a spot to mount a limit strap, reinforced bump stop plates, a drain hole below the lower shock mount, and built-in skid plates. These are super heavy duty.
So they're Mary-proof.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
While we're at it, we'll also be installing Overland Custom Design's newest version of their sway bar links. These have a maintenance-free joint very much like the stock originals, but the shaft is much stronger. Because the spindle gussets will cause a clearance issue for the wheels, we need to run spacers. The only spacers we'd ever run with are spider tracks. 1 1/4 inch thick, hub-centric, and machined perfectly.
Wheel spacers have gotten a bad rap, mostly because of installer error. We've had a set on our FJ for many, many years and haven't had any issues with them. As long as red Loctite is used on the hub studs and they're torqued properly, they're perfectly safe. Spider tracks anyways. I can't vouch for any others.
We do, however, plan on getting new rims with the proper offset in the near future. Then we can remove the spacers.
In addition to all those parts, we also need, just fly to get the hell out of here, Loctite. Blue for stuff that we're likely going to have to take apart again, and red for parts that we definitely don't want to have come loose. Anti-seize, plenty of anti-seize, regular for everything, and some high heat stuff for where the spacers go up against the hubs. Weldable zinc primer to coat those gussets before we have a chance to get them welded so they don't get any surface rust on them. New bearing seals. We'll likely screw one up when we're taking all this apart or putting it back together. And this will prevent that emergency run to the parts store.
One could hope.
Well, we have all the parts we'll need.
We hope.
Now on to fixing those problems. First thing we're going to do, because we're going to be welding on the frame, we're going to disconnect the battery. We have the 4Runner safely up on jack stands, very stable, with our floor jack as a safety. Now we can remove most all of this. I'm going to remove the speed sensor right here. Just take this one bolt out. And that should pull straight out. Be very careful with this because they're very expensive to replace. There. Then this bracket right here holding that speed sensor wire. We don't want to let anything happen to that wire either. Next, we'll take off this bracket holding the brake line and that sensor. First thing we're going to do is take the dust cap off the hub. Now we're going to remove the caliper and hang it off to the side by taking out these two bolts right here. I also had to take off this sensor bracket up here on the upper control arm. Then I was able to take the caliper and move it over there, and I have a stiff wire holding it up out of the way attached to the frame. Then off comes the rotor. And we'll take that axle nut off completely. Now I'm going to loosen these 4 bolts that hold the hub assembly onto the spindle. Just loosen them, don't take them all the way out yet. The sway bar link has to come off. To do that, put a wrench on the nut, and an Allen wrench goes in the end of that bolt coming out of the link. Now, the tie rod ends. Now before I removed this tie rod end completely from the spindle, I loosened up this jam nut because we're going to be replacing all our tie rod ends also, and this will make it easier later on. Now to get this separated, sometimes you can merely tap on the spindle side and that will loosen that taper, and sometimes not. All right, with a little persuasion, we got our tie rod end loose from the spindle. Next up, we're going to loosen up the upper ball joint. We're not going to take the nut all the way off, but we're going to make sure it's nice and loose so we can undo it by hand. Now we're going to loosen these 2 bolts up that hold that lower ball joint cradle or bracket or whatever they call it to the spindle. But we're not going to take them all the way out yet. Now I can take off the castle nut for the upper ball joint. These 2 bolts holding the lower control arm to the knuckle. Then with Mary's help, we'll pull this whole thing off. What could possibly go wrong? Yeah, this is the last one. After this, it's all on you. Ready? Okay, pull her out. Whew, there it is, folks. All right, there you go. Put it on the bench, start working on it.
I'm going to separate the bearing assembly from the spindle. Good thing Mark loosened up these bolts while this was still on. the dust shield comes right off. We need to get the seal out. We're going to be welding on it, and we were going to put new ones in anyway.
The lower control arm can come off now. These on our Toyotas are notorious for getting rusty and these bolts freezing up, holding it to the frame. But fingers crossed that it comes out without us having to saw off those bolts. Well, the rear one comes out real nice and easy, doesn't it? Whoops. In the front, it's not the bolt that freezes up like most of us have always thought, us too, up until a little while ago. It's actually there's a sleeve, a separate sleeve that goes through the metal sleeve that goes through the rubber bushings. That's what freezes together. And ours is froze solid. It's not coming out. So we're gonna have to cut it. We're gonna take Sawzall and we'll have to cut that inner sleeve off right here. I produced a video showing what I'm talking about with that inner sleeve and that, some details on that. I'll put a link to it at the end of this video. Now don't mess around with cheap blades. Go spend some money on carbide tipped or some demolition blades. A good one is Diablo blades for your Sawzall. And let's get at it. There it is. To make getting to the cam tabs on the frame a little bit easier, I'm going to take off our coilovers. You don't have to, but it's going to make life a little bit simpler for us. And while they're off, we'll inspect them and give them a good cleaning. All the demo work is done. Now we can start having some real fun. Now these spindle gussets are not going to fit perfectly right out of the box. We need to make sure that these holes on the side line up with the holes on the spindles. This one is for the sway bar link. This is for the brake line bracket. And ours are a little off. I'm going to have to do a little grinding down here at the bottom, maybe a little bit right here. Yeah. And that looks really nice. Those holes line up. Now I'm going to take a bolt, same size or correct size, put it through with a nut on the back just to hold it in place while it's being welded. At the top, there's going to be a big gap, and this is going to vary between vehicles. Total Chaos sends along 2 different thickness of bushings or washers or whatever you want to call these things to go in here, depending on how wide this gap is. However, I did not read the fine print when I bought these spindle gussets. It turns out that these will not fit on a spindle with normal upper ball joints. These only fit on the Total Chaos. I think they use uniballs with the threaded stud that goes all the way through, and they're long enough to use these. Our standard ball joint doesn't have enough threads on the bottom to get that castle nut on all the way. So we made our own little spacer up here. This will allow the castle nut to go threaded on all the way and get a socket on it. It'll do the job just as good as these. Next step is we need to remove the black paint on the spindle every place where we're going to be welding, because you can't weld through paint. I'm going to take a marker and mark where all the welds are going to be, and then take the sander and sand all that paint off. All right, I went ahead and took a Scotch-Brite pad and cleaned up all the existing black paint that we don't have to take all the way off. Just get all the grease off of it and make a good surface for paint. Now remember, I told you that you can't weld through paint. Well, you can't, but you can weld through zinc weldable primer. And that's what we're going to spray the spindle. And we already sprayed the gussets with it, so they wouldn't get any surface rust before we had a chance to get them welded. So a little bit more cleaning, a light coat of primer, and we'll send them off to Lars at Axle Fab to get welded. Now we can start working on the cam tabs on the frame. Oh, by the way, I have the axle out of ours. Not that we have to get to those cam tabs, although it helps. We have it out because we're also doing a video on changing out the needle bearing to the bushing from East Coast Gear Supply. When we get that video done, we'll put a link to it at the end of this one. To get these stock tabs off of the frame, we first have to drill out these little spot welds holding it on. I got those 3 spot welds on the front one drilled out. Now I can take it the rest of the way off with a chisel. Now I can go back and with the sander, make sure this is nice and clean and smoothed down and all the paint is off because we have to weld on here, so no paint can be on it.
We didn't have any welds break loose, but some of the tabs were bent out. You can see how flimsy the stock ones are. Good enough for taking the kids to soccer practice, but not strong enough for where we go. The other day, we got our spindles back from Lars, and he did a fantastic job welding the gussets on. Last night, Lars came over to our shop and welded the cam tab gussets on.
Now we can try to put all this back together, starting with our new lower control arms. First thing I'm going to do is put some grease on the inside surfaces of these brackets. That's where the control arm bushings are going to ride. So we'll slather on a good portion of that, both sides, front and back. Now onto the never sees. Lots and lots of never sees. What we do is we mix a little bit of regular chassis lube into the never sees because never sees has a tendency to dry out over a couple of years, so the grease will help to prevent it from doing that. I'm going to take a little bit of the never sees and put it where those cam washers are going to ride on the frame here. I'll be looking like the Tin Man from Wizard of Oz right after this, I'm sure. Onto the cam bolts. Put plenty of never sees on here. And then I accidentally already put it on the sleeve. But yeah, put the sleeve on. The rear bolt doesn't get one of those nylon sleeves, so just juice up the whole shaft of it. It wouldn't hurt to put a little bit of never sees in the lower arm too. You can never have too much of this stuff. And we'll start by putting the front cam bolt through. Now the manufacturer of these bolts recommend that you come with the bolt from the backside. like that. Now for the back bolt. And there we go. Perfect. Okay, those bolts are in. Now it's a good idea to double check the fitment of these cam washers in between the cam tabs before you put the bolts in. They can sometimes have a tight fit there, and you may have to take it to the grinder and grind a little bit off of the diameter of them. But that looks really good. And then you can test it, make sure that they spin in there. And they do. That one does anyways. Try the back one. And yep. All right. Now we're not gonna torque these down yet because we don't torque rubber bushings like this or poly bushings until there's weight on the suspension. So we'll have to wait till the very end to put the proper torque on these two. All right, next we can put the coilovers back on. I'm making sure that this is nice and clean where it's going to mate up at the top. Blue Loctite on the 3 top bolts. Now onto the lower bolt on the coilover. And the anti-seize on that. And a little bit inside the mounts here. Wouldn't hurt, I suppose. And then, now for some coilovers, there's gonna be a little space down here, or it's going to be too tight for your coilover. Either if it's too tight, you'll have to take and grind a little bit of the bushing off of the lower bolt on the coilover. In our case, we have a little gap, so we're going to fill that gap with just I think that's a 1/16 of an inch stainless steel washer that'll go in there. Actually, first I'm going to start the bolt. I think that'll be easier. So we'll bring the bolt in a little bit, try to put that washer in there. Get anti-seize all over the place. And we're in. Now clean the anti-seize off the threads. And for this, again, some blue Loctite on this nut. Now we can put this bracket down here on the lower ball joint. But for this taper joint, this taper, I'm going to put never season that too. I'll thank myself later, next time I have to take this apart. And no need for any Loctite on these threads because this is a castle nut. It'll have a cotter pin through it. And we're going to leave this fairly loose for now until after we get the spindle on here. Okay, I've got our new axle seal already in the spindle. Now we can put the bearing assembly on the other side. But first, I'm not going to make this mistake twice. First, the brake shield or brake dust shield or whatever the heck they call this thing has to go on. Now there's going to be a clearance problem up here where the shield touches the spindle. You're going to have to take a hammer and bash that in a little bit. Now this can go on, the wheel or the bearing assembly can go on, but first some red Loctite on these threads. And tighten this down evenly and it'll go in nice for you. Now I'll tighten these down as much as I can here, but we'll give it the final ooga doogas once it's installed and we can put some pressure on it. And while I have it here at the bench, I'm going to take some more of that high temp never seize and put some on the splines where the axle comes in. First I have to put the axle shaft back in. There she goes. This is the factory bump stop that we took out earlier. Now for the lower control arm, they send along this bushing to go between it and the frame. First, some blue Loctite. Now before we even attempt to put the spindle back on, we're going to have everything prepped, because this is kind of one of those things where you need 3-4 hands to get it in there right. But here we only have 2. So these are the supplied bolts with the lower control arm, the new one. They go in from the bottom like this, and they also supply these spacers to go in here between this ball joint mount and the spindle. On these bolts, plenty of red Loctite. And on this upper ball joint, plenty of never sees on that taper. Put the axle through the bearing. And we will start these lower, get one of these lower bolts started anyways. First, put that spacer in between, and then a bolt. Now we can put this top ball joint through there and get the castle nut on the back side. And it's starting to look like something now, huh? All right, we're going to be putting new outer tie rod ends on ours just because we can, because everything is open like this, and the old ones had 100,000 miles on them, so new ones are going on. This is where never sees will really make your alignment tech happy. First we took a wire wheel and got all the crap off these threads. Then you just thread the new tie rod end on. We're going to take ours on all the way, and then we'll adjust the toe after we get everything on and the tires on. Then, plenty of never sees on this taper fit here. And we can wrestle it into place. Yeah, that went in good. Put the castle nut on. All right. As you can see, we went ahead and put our sway bar link on. These go on real simple, self-explanatory. You will have, if you use these heavy-duty type of links that are a little bit larger than stock, you're going to have a clearance problem with your spindle gusset. You're going to have to cut a little bit away in order to fit that in there. But it goes in great. Put some blue Loctite on the threads. This has lock nuts and lock washers. It's not going to come apart. Now we can go ahead and put our rotor on. And before I brought it over here, I put some high temp never sees on the inside where it's going to touch our hub. Now this is where you need to look and see if it's going to scratch. Yep, it's scratching on our dust shield because the spindle gusset is pushing it out a little bit. Even though we put that little dimple in the back side of this shield, it's still rubbing. So I'm going to go like this a little bit, take it off, and see where it was scratching if I can. Still a little bit more. There we go. That sounds better. Now we can bring the caliper back on. Red Loctite on those two caliper bolts. caliper is on. The brake line bracket went on. I had to bend it a little bit to make it go on. All the sensor brackets for the wheel sensor are on. The wheel sensor is back in. And you know what? I have no bolts left over. So not even washers. So I think this is a great success so far. We have our axle nut all torqued down, dust cap back on it. And like we said earlier in the video, we have to run wheel spacers now because our stock offset wheels will interfere with the spindle gusset right here. So spider tracks 1.25 inches. Aren't they pretty? Before I put them on, I'm going to put some of this high temp anti-seize on the back side where it's going to hit the rotor. Now the trick to making wheel spacers safe to run, red Loctite, and lots of it on these studs, on the factory studs. I'm also putting them inside the nuts too. Then I'm just gonna snug these up evenly. And then Mary's gonna get in, or not in, but hang in there and put her hands on the brake pedal so I can torque these to spec. And that's the second thing that keeps these wheel spacers safe, is torquing them to the manufacturer's spec. Don't be putting an impact on here and taking them up to 150, 200 foot-pounds. That'll snap these studs off. After getting it all put back together, we did a primitive eyeball alignment. Then took it over to Ray's alignments to get it dialed in. Ray was easily able to get us our desired 4.8 degrees of caster. This is what our alignment points look like now. It hasn't been this symmetrical since we bent that spindle.
The ride is just as good as it was before. It goes straight for a long time with no hands on the wheel. When doing a sweeping turn, like an on-ramp, there's a little more resistance in the wheel. I like that.
As far as rubbing goes, these are the typical 285 70-17 tires, and with a simple body mount chop down here, there is no rubbing at all, even with using those spacers.
After finishing all that up, we drove it around 70 miles, then Mark went back and checked and retorqued every nut and bolt that we touched, even the wheel spacers. Then put torque stripes on everything so we can see at a glance if anything loosens up.
Here are a few videos we think you'll enjoy.
As always, thanks for watching, and we hope you'll consider subscribing. Last night, Lars came and welded the cam tab gussets? The added caster does something, doesn't it?
Should. You would think it would.